Good morning, everyone. Welcome to UUSF Forum. If this is your first time here, we're glad to have you here. If you're back, we're glad you're back. Today is the day before the inauguration of our new president, and many of you may know that some people are not very comfortable with the policies we expect from that, which is the topic of today's presentation, by the way. There's also going to be a protest today in Civic Center starting at around 1 o'clock that many of us are planning to go to. So we invite you and welcome you to do that with us. Today is also, I understand, the first day of the ceasefire in Gaza, which is something we've been waiting for 16 months now. Thank goodness for that. I hope it holds. Let's keep our fingers crossed on that. By the way, I'm Jeff Peckrell, and I am part of the Human Rights Working Group Committee here at the church, along with Melvin Starks and Dolores Perez Heilbrunn, and the forum as well. If you did not get an email about this, I'm glad you made it anyway, but if you want to get our emails, there's a sign-up sheet on the table back there. You can sign it, and we'll add you to our mailing list. We have another forum next Sunday. Next Sunday, we have Norm Solomon coming to talk about militarism and U.S. foreign policy. So it should be very interesting and insightful. We actually don't have anything scheduled right now for February, which I'm trying to work on fixing. February is Black History Month, and we really want to see some topics relating to that important subject, right? We do have everything scheduled for March, however. So we'll be back for sure in after next Sunday, which is the last Sunday of February. We'll be back in early March. If any of you have ideas for things that we could do in February, Black History Month related or not, please let me know, or any of us, Melvin or Dolores or I, or any of us, and we'd like to investigate those ideas. We welcome your ideas. Let's see what else. The way we do Q&A in the sessions here is we do them all at the end. So you'll see cards on the chairs and the tables. Please jot your questions down. And then at the conclusion of the presentation, we'll be asking all the questions from up here. And that helps ensure that all the questions make it into the Zoom call. By the way, we have folks on Zoom too, and I'll be watching Zoom for any questions that are entered there. So I think that's all in the way of announcements. Is there anything else? So I'll ask Dolores to please do our Ohlone land recognition.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. I'm going to do an Ohlone land recognition right now. We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that our community is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working here, and we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral territory of the Miwok, Yokuts, Patwin, and other tribes. As the original stewards of this land, the indigenous peoples understood the interconnectedness of all things and nature and maintained harmony with it for millennia. We honor them now for their enduring commitment to our Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolores. Today's speaker is David Bacon, and I understand that David has spoken here several times, or at least a couple of times before. We were chatting before the talk, and he said that when he did this before, that Noam Chomsky was also here. So that must have been a really great talk. He's here to talk about immigration, which, if you're paying attention to the news, is something that Donald Trump cares about greatly, not in the right way, perhaps. So we're going to be learning today about what we can expect under the Trump administration in terms of immigration policies. David Bacon is a former union organizer and factory worker, has been a journalist and photographer for 30 years, and is the author of several books, including Illegal People, The Right to Stay Home, and More Than a Wall, Más que un Muro. So with that, I'd like to welcome David Bacon.
Morning, everyone. Thank you to the UU Forum for organizing this very important discussion. We need this opportunity to talk about what we can expect from the new Trump administration in terms of immigration enforcement and what we can do about it. After the presentation, I hope that we can hear everyone's questions and thoughts. I'm also going to show some photographs while I'm speaking, and these give you a piece of the history of our movement over the last 30 years and the faces of many of the people involved. Organizations and coalitions that defend immigrant workers and their families and their communities have historically been pillars of movements for deeper social change in this country. This history can help us to appreciate their great persistence and their strategic visions as they fought back against threats of deportation, as we do today. But more than that, they have imagined a future of greater equality, of working class rights and social solidarity, and they've proposed ways to get us there. I've divided my presentation into 4 parts. First, I want to talk about what Trump can and cannot do, focusing especially on people who are working in the fields. And then I want to talk about the history, a little bit of the resistance in working class communities to deportations, and then the history of workplace raids specifically, and then finally end with a little discussion about what lies beyond the threat of deportation. So let's get started. First, in terms of what Trump can and can't do. Immigration enforcement does not exist on its own. It has a function in a larger system that serves capitalist economic interests by providing a labor force that employers need. Immigrant labor is more vital than ever to many industries in this country. More than 50% of the entire agricultural workforce of 2 million people here is undocumented. And the list of other industries that rely on immigrant labor is very long: meatpacking, construction, building services, healthcare, restaurants, retail, hotels, and more. So President Trump, to be, is not free to eliminate this workforce. And this is potentially a source of power for workers. Employers know this. And within months of his inauguration last time in 2017, agribusiness executives were already meeting with him to ensure that threats of a closed border and raids would not be used when they needed labor. Last month, construction companies in Texas warned Trump that mass deportations would threaten their profits. And remember that in 2006, some California farmers even bussed their workers to the big marches in the hopes that the Sensenbrenner bill would not deprive them of workers. But workers, communities, and unions, we can't rely on employers to fight Trump for us. What businesses need is labor at a price that they're willing to pay, and the current system has served them well. The Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that about 8 million of the 11 to 12 million undocumented people in the United States are wage workers, and most work at or near the minimum wage, some below it. The abysmal federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour produces an annual income of a little over $14,000. And higher minimums in states like ours here in California only produce an income of barely twice that amount. The median household income for farm workers, for instance, in this country is less than $25,000. And yet Social Security estimates that the median wage in the United States today is $66,000. So you can see what the difference is there. And that gap is a source of enormous profits. If industries that rely on immigrant labor paid the average wage, they would have to pay undocumented workers an additional $250 billion. So the profits that they make from low-paid labor are enormous. And Trump needs to ensure not only that workers contribute their labor, but that the cost is acceptable to employers. Okay. In those 2017 meetings with farmers, Trump promised to expand the contract labor system, in which up to 1 million people are hired by employers and work in the United States every year. These workers can only come to work. They can't stay. In other words, people who are brought to the U.S. And the visa categories include the notorious H-2A program for agricultural labor, like the old Bracero program of the 1950s. Last year, farmers received 370,000 H-2A visa certifications, which is 1/6 of the entire workforce in agriculture here. This program is notorious for abusing workers, and recent reforms by Labor Secretary Julie Su are not going to survive this new administration. The H-2A program is huge, but others like it are growing in hospitality, the meat industry, and other industries, even for teachers in schools. There is no way to recruit and deploy so many workers without displacing the existing workforce, which is largely made up of immigrants also, but people who already live here. For farm worker unions and their advocates, this poses a dilemma, and the expansion of this H-2A program is going to deepen it. How can these unions organize and defend the existing workforce, those people who are here, including their members, while also fighting for the people who are hired to replace them? Yet H-2A farm workers, these people who are brought here on those visas, are not simply passive victims. They have a history of protesting exploitation, but for them to strike means being fired, and being fired means losing your visa and then having to leave, and then also being blacklisted from future recruitment. Yet despite these risks, these workers sometimes act when conditions become bad enough. Unions like Familias Unidas por la Justicia in Washington that we see here have helped contract workers when strikes break out, but growers keep those workers isolated, making it difficult for them to organize. Meanwhile, Familias Unidas and other unions protest the displacement because job loss in farm worker communities means hunger and evictions. In many farm worker localities, existing workers increasingly fear being replaced. Strikes to raise wages are risky and less frequent because people fear that. At the Ostrom mushroom plant, for instance, in Washington state, local workers who are members of the United Farm Workers have been on strike for 2 years against their replacement by H-2A visa recruits. The current fight within the Republican Party that we've been reading about between the so-called nativists and Elon Musk makes it very clear once again that ensuring a labor supply to corporations is Trump's primary obligation. Tech companies, from Microsoft to Tesla, want to use the H-1B visa program to keep its software workforce at substandard wages. They expect Trump to meet their demands, and they poured money into his campaign to make sure that that happens. Bernie Sanders says that the function of this visa is, and this is quoting him, is not to hire the best and the brightest, but rather to replace good-paying jobs with low-wage indentured servants. The cheaper the labor they hire, the more money the billionaires make. That's what Bernie says about it. While the number of new applications for those workers is capped at 66,000 per year, which is what you read in the paper, the visa lasts for 3 years and it can be renewed. As a result, the number of H-1B workers in the country in 2019 was over 600,000 workers. Sanders charges that the top 30 companies that are using this program laid off 85,000 workers living here last year while they were bringing these new workers on the H-1B visas. So let's talk about the resistance to the raids. For decades, immigration enforcement has combined workplace enforcement with community-based raids and sweeps. Chicago's working-class neighborhoods have a long history of big marches to protest immigration raids. When Obama, for instance, entered his second term in 2013, activists in Chicago, including Occupy Chicago, blocked buses that were heading to the immigration courts. Similar direct actions were used in Tucson, Arizona by young people who chained themselves to buses transporting detainees to the special immigration court. And remember, in 2013, the number of people deported from the US was 400,000. Trump's 2016 campaign promised to turn Chicago into a hotbed of enforcement. As the anti-immigrant hysteria promoted by his campaign spread, ICE began stopping people on the street, knocking on apartment doors, and pulling people out for detention. This enforcement spree, which continued through 2019, included raids on street corners and sidewalks near Home Depot and other gathering spots for day laborers. In fact, the public presence of day laborers, the folks that we see on Cesar Chavez, has historically made them a particular target of immigration street raids. In other words, it's really easy for the ICE to roll up in its van and pick people up. And this is just what happened in Bakersfield last week, where ICE agents raided a gathering place for farm workers and day laborers outside of a Home Depot store. Activists responded to Trump's threats with actions. In 2019, thousands of people in Chicago marched through the Loop, chanting, "Immigrants are welcome here." And in Federal Plaza, they gathered after learning that ICE agents were about to be deployed from there. An article last week in the New York Times says that Chicago will again be the target of a national raid this coming Tuesday. They're trying to show us that the gloves are off and to terrorize us into paralysis. But people in Chicago are already mobilizing as they did in 2019, and we have to be ready here too. San Francisco is high on their list, and we know from our experience that resistance in the street works. Chicago also saw one of the most effective direct actions in the campaign against deportations. As President Obama prepared his reelection campaign in 2012, young undocumented immigrants like this young woman here, brought to the United States as children, occupied his campaign office. The occupation capped 2 years of organizing marches, fiercely fighting the detention of activists. They pushed for the passage of a law that would give them amnesty from deportation, and after his reelection, President Obama issued an executive order, DACA, which stands for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that postponed their deportation. DACA has withstood a legal onslaught for a decade, but right-wing courts and the MAGA administration are no doubt going to try and kill it again. They've said that they're going to do this. For hundreds of thousands of people who had to provide their personal information, like where they lived, when they were applying for these visas, immigration authorities are going to be able to use it to find them, to go to their homes and detain them. The same problem faces beneficiaries of temporary protected status, which allows people who are fleeing environmental or political dangers to stay and work here in the United States. If Trump tries to withdraw that protection, which he has promised to do, legally or not, the information to detain people is already in the hands of the government. The most effective resistance to immigration enforcement in recent history was the result of the massive immigration marches of 2006. Sparked by the House passage of H.R. 4425, the Sensenbrenner bill, people took to the streets by the millions on May Day. That law would have made it a federal crime to be in the United States without immigration papers, a danger so extreme that it threatened every family. The demonstration relied on Spanish language radio to spread the word and on networks of immigrant rights activists and organizations that brought together people from the same hometown. And remember, Trump has promised to do the same thing again. In other words, to make it a federal crime to be here in the United States without papers. Labor unions were prominent among the mobilizers, organizing one of the 2 marches that were held on the same day in Los Angeles, each of which drew more than 1 million people. This is one that we're looking at here. Labor unions and immigrant networks organized marches of hundreds of thousands in cities across the country, including here in San Francisco and the Bay Area. The message was further strengthened by a grassroots movement which was called A Day Without Mexicans, which urged immigrant workers to stay home to demonstrate how essential their labor is. This movement achieved at least its short-term goal because H.R. 4425 died, and the impact of the marches remains with us. After 2006, mass demonstrations still take place every May Day. They may not be as large as they were in 2006, but they still attract progressive community and worker activists in large numbers. And these marches can provide us again with a vehicle to challenge the renewed threat of deportation. Now to talk a little bit about defending workers against workplace raids. And this again is a march here in San Francisco through financial district. One of the first battles against workplace raids took place at the Craco car radio factory in Los Angeles in the early 1980s. Workers who joined the United Electrical Workers stopped production lines to force the owner to deny entry to immigration agents, and they saved each other from deportation. Later, the Molders Union, Local 164 in Oakland, joined the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund in suing what was then used to be called the Immigration and Naturalization Service over its practice of having immigration agents lock factory gates, hold workers prisoner, and then interrogate them and detain undocumented workers. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, which declared the practice unconstitutional. It was a different court in those days. They still cannot enter. In other words, immigration still cannot enter a workplace without a warrant and the names of the people they intend to detain. In one of the Bush administration's final raids in 2008, immigration agents took 481 workers from Howard Industries, which was an electrical equipment factory in Mississippi, and they took them to a private detention center in Jena, Louisiana. They were not charged, they had no access to lawyers, and they could not be released on bail. Jim Evans, who's the national organizer for the AFL-CIO in Mississippi and a leading member of the Black Caucus in Mississippi's state legislature, he said, "This raid is an effort to drive immigrants out of Mississippi and a blow to immigrants, African Americans, whites, and unions. In other words, all those people who want political change here." Howard Industries was one of the state's few unionized factories and paid $2 an hour less than the norm for that industry. Evans said the people who benefit from Mississippi's low-wage system want it to stay the way it is, and that's why that immigration raid was used to attack that union. The activists from the Mississippi Immigrant Rights Alliance responded to the raid with organizing, and they sat on the grass outside the plant with the families of those people who had been detained. When the shift changed, African American workers started coming out of the factory, and they approached these Mexican and Latino women and started hugging them. They said, "We're saying things like, 'We're with you. We're glad you're here.'" The key strategy of this Immigration Rights Alliance in Mississippi is to forge unity between immigrant and African American workers, a lesson for us all. We have a long history of these fights here in the Bay Area too. This is a photograph from the 2-year fight of hotel workers in Emeryville at the Woodfin Suites against their firing. Thousands of laid off workers were targeted by the Obama administration's key enforcement program, which consisted of identifying undocumented workers and then forcing companies to fire them. Without work or money for rent and food, presumably they would, as they say, call it in those days, and still, they would self-deport. In other words, conditions would be so unbearable that people would just simply leave the country. In Minneapolis, Seattle, and San Francisco here, more than 1,800 janitors lost their jobs. In 2009, more than 2,000 young women working on American Apparel sewing machines in LA were fired. The director of ICE under President Obama, John Morton, said that ICE had audited more than 2,900 companies in just 1 year, and the number of people who were fired ran into the tens of thousands. In 2011, Chipotle, the restaurant chain, fired hundreds of them across Minnesota. Their crime was that they were working, but they had no immigration papers. In Minneapolis, the Service Employees Union Local 26 helped Chipotle workers organize marches and demonstrations in cooperation with United Workers Center in Struggle, which was a local worker center, and the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee. People were arrested for civil disobedience at a Chipotle restaurant and organized a boycott of the chain. With this pressure, the firings of workers at Chipotle stopped. In other words, organizing worked. It is now almost certain that this enforcement tactic will be the key to the new administration as well. When Trump was inaugurated in 2017, many unions expected workplace raids and firings to be a major part of his enforcement program. The hotel union in Oakland developed a proactive strategy to keep ICE out of workplaces and called on the Oakland City Council to protect immigrants on the job. The City Council passed a resolution noting that it had been a city of refuge since the anti-apartheid movement of the mid-1980s, a movement in which this church had a very proud history. We have to make sure that this idea of workplace protection is as much a part of sanctuary cities as non-cooperation between the police and ICE. Trump is threatening again, as he did in 2016, to end federal funding for more than 300 sanctuary cities, and this city is one of them. In addition, many cities, even some states, have withdrawn from what was called the 287G program, which required police to arrest and detain people based on their immigration status. So police in San Francisco no longer can do this. But Trump promises to reinstate the 287G program and then to cancel federal funding to cities that don't cooperate. Seeking alternatives, many unions, like Unite HERE Local 2 here, began negotiating protections in their union contracts. They require managers to notify them if immigration agents try to enter, question workers, or demand documents. That union contract here in San Francisco says that the hotel has to keep agents out unless they have a court order. And then the union helped workers hold out at a hotel where new owners demanded that they show their immigration papers to keep their jobs. All of the hotel workers refused, documented and undocumented alike. California's Janitors Union, United Service Workers West, which is part of SEIU, wrote the Immigrant Worker Protection Act, which is a state law here that requires employers to seek a court order before granting ICE agents access to a workplace. It prohibits employers from sharing sensitive information such as Social Security numbers without a warrant. This law came after years of fighting workplace raids and immigration-related firings. In 2011, Los Angeles janitors sat down at city intersections to protest layoffs at Able Building Maintenance and fought similar layoffs at Stanford University cafeterias and among janitors at Apple and Hewlett-Packard down in Silicon Valley. That law is still on the books, and we have to ensure that it's enforced, starting with Rob Bonta, who's our progressive attorney general. When Trump took office in 2017, the ILWU, Filipino Advocates for Justice, and several other groups held trainings to prepare workers for raids. Union members role-played situations in which strikes were used to protect each other. Some were veterans of an earlier organizing drive among recycling workers in which they stopped work to prevent the company from firing employees for not having papers. 2 decades ago, small groups of workers in wealthy Palm Springs fought a crucial battle at the Palm Canyon Resort, where they were working for $4.75 an hour. When they began organizing with Unite HERE Local 309, the hotel hired security guards dressed in uniforms imitating those of the Border Patrol and began firing workers. Immigrant housekeepers organized a silent march in the street, prayed in the parking lot, and then refused to go back to work. They stayed out on strike for 4 months until Palm Canyon was eventually forced to reinstate them with back pay. But when the hotel said that only workers with legal immigration status could return, everybody else remained out on strike for another month, documented and undocumented people together until everybody was able to go back. What makes their experience important today is not just the inspiring courage, but the strategic ideas that guided those workers. They organized around the concrete conditions of their lives. Faced with legal repression and layoffs, they took action. Knowing that they could not fight alone, they sought help. And the union stood by them. And most important, they stuck together. That same year, the AFL-CIO held its convention in Los Angeles, focusing on organizing immigrant workers. Rejecting the history in our labor movement of supporting anti-immigrant laws, the Federation adopted a resolution calling for amnesty for undocumented immigrants and the repeal of the law that prevents them from working, and that is still the position of our labor movement today. Unions then organized a series of hearings across the country to denounce the violation of immigrant workers' rights, and that could be a strategy that we could use again, these national hearings. Finally, I want to talk about what lies beyond this threat of deportation. In the civil rights era, the fight against the Cold War mass deportations and the Bracero program was two-pronged. In other words, in 1954, the U.S. deported 1 million people, and that same year, growers were able to import 450,000 workers from Mexico under the Bracero program. Leaders of the Chicano civil rights movement, in particular, Bert Corona, Cesar Chavez, Larry Itliong, a Filipino, Dolores Huerta, fought to end the program, a demand that they won in 1964. That's when the Bracero program stopped. But the movement did more than fight abuses. It proposed and fought for fundamental change. In part, this played out on the ground. In 1965, Larry Itliong and veteran Filipino farm unionists initiated the Great Grape Strike a year after the Bracero program ended. That same year, the civil rights movement among Chicanos, Mexicanos, and Asian Americans achieved a fundamental change in U.S. immigration law. The family preference system, which favored family reunification over the labor needs of employers, became the basis of U.S. immigration policy, at least for a time, and it still is. Rene Salcedo, who many of us might remember as a worker organizer with a long history in the mission, says, in the flow of people crossing the border, we see our families and coworkers, while the companies see only money. So we have to fight for what we really need and not just what we don't want. In other words, the fight to stop deportations requires fighting for an alternative. And there have been many such alternative proposals over the last 2 decades, from the Dignity Campaign to the American Friends Service Committee's program, A New Path. Today, the movement for an alternative is centered on what's called the Registry Bill, which is a bill that's been introduced into Congress that would give legal status to an estimated 8 million undocumented people by simply changing the date when people without legal status can apply for naturalization. Other long-term demands include expanding voting rights. In the MAGA strongholds, like Bakersfield, for instance, if the entire working population could vote, we could elect representatives who would pass social protections for all workers. So rather than thinking of voting as a restricted privilege, as we're taught, we need to think of it as a weapon and understand how powerful unity could make us beyond the barriers of immigration status. In other words, if everybody who works can vote. Likewise, the political education of working people in this country has to include an understanding of the roots of migration. Our actions of our government abroad, from military intervention to economic sanctions to neoliberal reforms, make migration a matter of survival for millions of people. When Mexicans fight for the right to stay home instead of coming north and elect a government that promises to move in that direction, which is what they did 6 years ago, and again this last year, they deserve and they need the support of working people on our side of the border. Cross-border solidarity has a long history, but the media denies us any knowledge of it. Without an independent effort to educate working families, the door is opened to MAGA and is closed to our ability to organize in our own interest. Faced with 281 million people in this world who live outside their countries of origin, the United Nations has adopted the Convention on the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. This convention supports the right to family reunification. It establishes the principle of equal treatment with citizens of the host country in relation to employment and education. It protects migrants against collective deportation, which is what we're facing now, and makes both countries of origin and destination countries responsible for protecting these rights. However, so far, only 49 countries, that is, the countries that migrants are coming from, like Mexico and the Philippines, have ratified this convention. No U.S. administration, Democrat or Republican, has ever even submitted it to Congress for ratification. In the face of mass deportations and raids and other tactics, immigrant workers have been a vital part of the organizing that has changed politics in this country. It has produced unions spanning from copper miners to janitors. It has upended the politics of cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it is the target of the wave of enforcement coming from this current MAGA regime. Fear and hunger have always been and still are the most powerful weapons used to force people to leave. And the euphemism in the 1930s, when they had the big deportation wave, was called repatriation. Today, immigration agents and their defenders call it self-deportation. The idea is the same. In other words, you make life so unbearable that people will leave. And Trump and Vance are just the latest in a long line of proponents of this inhumane idea. But always, with the hunger and terror of deportations, immigrant workers have fought against exploitation and discrimination. Even in the 1930s, which were the years of the maximum number of people deported from this country, they led bloody strikes in mines and fields. In fact, the largest agricultural workers' strike in the history of the United States, the Pixley Cotton Strike, broke out in 1933 in the barrios of the San Joaquin Valley, which was the same year that they had the maximum number of deportations. It's important to remember this history of resistance as the history of the deportations themselves. The organizations that were created by the resistance and by the broader working class movement of which they were a part were not wiped out by the wave of deportations. In fact, the immigrant rights movement of the past 2 decades inherited this legacy, and it is a history of courageous struggle and a reservoir of strategic thinking that can help us all confront the repression that is promised by Trump. So knowing our history and taking action, we can win. So is it possible? Yes, it's possible. ¿Se puede? Sí se puede. So I'd like to end this by doing what Dolores always does at the end of her meetings, and that is, do you know how to do the farm worker clap? So this is a way of saying, ¿se puede? What's the answer to se puede? Sí se puede. ¿Se puede? Sí se puede. ¿Se puede? Sí se puede. And the clap goes. Sí se puede. Thank you.
David Bankin, thank you very much for your presentation and for your willingness to answer the questions that have been written down. If you have a question, please write it down as neatly as you could. This questioner says, I continue to be disturbed by the term undocumented versus illegal applied to immigrants. We should acknowledge illegal and work harder for an improved process for giving legal access to such contributing people. Is there any progress on this?
So the question is about, well, there's really 2 questions there. One is about whether we should call people undocumented or illegal. And then is there any progress on providing people a means for coming to this country legally? And I think illegal is like an insulting term. It's a pejorative term, really. Human beings are not legal or illegal. We're just human beings. And undocumented describes what the status is of somebody who is here, who crossed the border without a visa. In other words, they don't have documents. And the solution to that problem is for people to be able to get documents and to have legal status. That's one of it. And that's what the registry bill does. And the other part of it is to provide people with a means of coming here legally. And what we have now, especially with Trump, is a government that is basically determined to stop people from coming. And they'll build a wall, hold people in detention camps on the other side of the border, and so on. This is not going to stop people from coming here because the reasons why people have to leave home and have to come here are much stronger than the walls and the criminalization. So what we need to do is to do things like they did in the 60s, which was to pass legislation which provides for means for people to come here legally, other than coming here simply as kind of work animals for growers or for employers.
David Bacon, can you describe what form, what process will occur on Tuesday in Chicago?
The question is what's going to happen in Chicago on Tuesday. What we know about it is what was announced actually by ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency of the Department of Homeland Security. And they say that they are going to have a nationally publicized immigration raid in which they are inviting other parts of their agency and other parts of the country to bring agents to Chicago. So what they've said is that they're going to have 1,000 immigration agents in Chicago. And what are they going to do with them? Well, what they did last time was they set up street barriers. They interrogated people on the street, presumably based on what people look like. They went to people's homes. They went to people's workplaces, and they began wholesale picking up people, interrogating people, and then picking up people for deportation. So that's one thing that they plan in Chicago. But again, what people in Chicago did last time around in 2019 was they had big demonstrations and marches against it, including in Federal Plaza, which is where the agents are dispatched from, basically saying that they were going to try and prevent them from doing this. And Chicago has a very progressive city government right now. Chuy Garcia is the Congress member from Chicago, or a Congress member from Chicago. In other words, Chicago's political, its elected officials and its organizations, social and political organizations, are determined to stop this. And I think that we ought to look at San Francisco here and think about what our response would be if we were similarly targeted, and that is going to happen. So we need to think about what we expect from our elected officials and from unions and other organizations in our community as well, too.
Trump threatens to open new immigrant detention centers. Can you comment on the movement to close detention centers, both public and private, and what you believe has been their success?
Well, this is a question about detention centers and what their role has been and whether we've been successful at closing them. There is a movement to close detention centers. We have a law in the books that dates back from the Obama era, which requires the government to maintain beds in privately run immigration prisons for 34,000 people every night. So that's what we're up against. And we have corporations that make a lot of money from doing this. And so they are constantly lobbying for the increase in that number. And they are undoubtedly lobbying the Trump administration for permits to build more centers and to fill them with more people. That being said, we have here in California and have had a movement to close them. So some of the photographs you see, including the one that's on the screen right now, are from the effort to close the Richmond Detention Center, which was when ICE rented a part of the city jail in Richmond and used it to house detainees. And we had vigils that were organized especially by Reverend Deborah Lee, who you see at the right in this image here, and Reverend Lee and a whole cadre of activists, and especially in the social concerns committees of churches, organized vigils for 7 years. And at the end of that, they finally forced the Contra Costa County to end the use of its jail as a detention center. And they've gone on to organize marches against detention centers throughout California. That was successful in getting California to pass a law that would have shut down privately run detention centers. That was challenged in the courts. We lost that case. But there is still a movement that includes people in the legislature. And for that matter, the governor signed that bill. So we need to keep up the pressure to close those detention centers. So on the one hand, we've got the Trump administration and these corporations pushing for expanding them and filling them. And on the other side, we have us, and that is the movement to try to close them.
You had mentioned in your presentation the benefits that big business gets from immigrant labor. There are two questions very similar here. Is our southern border basically a tool for big agricultural companies? And then is the threat of deportation possibly a ploy to exploit immigrant labor, which big business obviously needs?
So the question is, two questions. One is, does the border benefit employers in terms of their conditions they impose on immigrant workers? And the second question was about,
Is the threat of deportation a way to exploit immigrant labor more pronounced?
is the threat of deportation used to exploit immigrant labor? The border itself is not what the border does is that when people cross it without papers, they become undocumented. In other words, subject to deportation. And that threat is used by employers, as the second question asks, is used as a way of pushing down people's standard of living. In other words, don't protest, don't go on strike, don't try and get anything better because you're vulnerable. And it's not just what happens to people at work and the direct or indirect threat from employers, but that you live in a farm town like Delano, for instance, where the immigration service is active and you worry about being picked up in the streets. And that's in normal times. That we're not even talking about what's going to happen in this coming period here. And so you worry about, for instance, your kids, what are your kids going to do if they're in school and you get picked up? So you live in a climate of fear, and that fear basically is used to try to discourage people from organizing. But I think also we need to say that despite that, there is a long history of undocumented people organizing against this. In fact, some unions, like the janitors union and the farm workers union, are in large part the creation of immigrant workers, including undocumented workers who have stood up against that fear. So it cuts both ways.
Why not simply have open borders?
Well, the question is, why not simply have open borders? And I think that what do we mean by open borders? In other words, the proposal would be for a border in which people can cross without any kind of immigration control. And that's what used to exist in Europe, between countries in Europe under the Schengen Agreement. And that's over the years has been eroded pretty substantially. But also, as we saw in Europe, while that was true about travel between countries in Europe, you had a wall, in effect, around Europe that was so strict that hundreds and hundreds of people drowned in the Mediterranean every year trying to get into Europe and cross that border. So it's not really sufficient to talk about what the border between the U.S. and Mexico is going to look like. The people who are in the detention camps on the U.S.-Mexican border come from more than just Mexico. They come from Venezuela, or they come from Cuba, or they come from Haiti. In fact, part of the immigration effort of the U.S. administrations, Democrat and Republican, has been to kind of move the border south, so that the immigration control really exists on the border between Chiapas and Guatemala, and not so much between the border between the U.S. and Mexico. So we need to look at the movement of people around the world. I think that people have a right to move. People have a right to migrate and a right to travel. But in order to make that right something more than just a slogan of saying open borders, we need to do something about the reasons why people are forced into migration to begin with. And we need to see that the changing of our immigration system is tied to social changes in other parts of our economy as well, too. Just one example. Many of the reasons why people are leaving home in order to come here have to do with U.S. military and interventionist policies in other countries. And so, obviously, if we cut the military budget and we prohibit the export of weapons and we stop intervening in other countries, then the reasons why people have to leave become much more bearable and much more ones that people can handle. So that's part of open borders too, right? And these all things are things that are not immediately on the agenda. In other words, what's on the agenda is stopping the deportations this coming week. And that's what we're going to be doing at 1 p.m. in City Hall Plaza in Civic Center. But we also need to have in front of us the idea of what we want the world to look like. And that's why I think this is a very important question. What is our alternative? Where do we want to go? What kind of world do we actually want to live in?
Following up on what you said here, the questioner says, I've read where 3.4% of the world's population live in countries that they were not born in. If they were a country, they would be the fourth biggest in the world. Millions of people around the world are immigrants. Can you comment on the conditions, such as economic and climate, that compel people to leave their homelands?
The question is to comment on the reason why people leave home and the incredibly large number of people who are living outside the countries in which they're born. I don't know about the exact percentage here, but it's certainly in the hundreds of millions of people. Climate change, environmental refugees, we hear and read about that. Economic refugees, people who are coming from countries where migration is the only way for families to eat and to survive. People who are fleeing wars. What ties all of these things together? And I think what it is that we are living in a world where people are dealing with the legacy of colonialism and the legacy of how the world was organized in the last 3 centuries, in which the United States and other wealthy countries basically created a system in the rest of the world for that kind of exploitation and that kind of benefit. That's why we have the wars. The wars that we have in the world are still primarily have their roots in this in colonialism, and certainly the difference economically between the U.S. and Mexico has to do with the relationship between the US and Mexico and that history of imperialism and colonialism. And now, when we're facing climate change, what we're also facing is the world that was created by the creation of the industrial economies of wealthy countries, which are having impacts not just on us, which they clearly do, as we saw in the fires in Los Angeles, but are having enormous impacts on people in other countries as well, too. And so part of the demands that people are making around migration is that if we don't want to be forced into migration, the industrial countries of the world have to take responsibility, economic responsibility, money for what you did, and to help us to establish conditions which will enable us to keep living in the countries where we are. Otherwise, we become migrants coming to the U.S. So these are all parts of the inheritance or the legacy of colonialism. And, that's why it takes such fundamental change in this world in order to create a just world in which migration isn't a forced migration, but something that people can freely choose and do for other reasons. We need to change the world, in other words. And that's a pretty tall order.
Could you say more about family preference policy? And further, is there a way to implement the family preference policy globally, such as ensconced somehow in international law?
Well, the family preference system was created in 1965. And again, this was a creation of the civil rights movement. And what it does is it says that for people who are living in the United States, who have families living in other countries, that those family members can apply for visas to come to the United States. And depending on what the relationship is, they get essentially put on a list and eventually receive a visa. And this was a policy that was established in opposition to the Bracero program. The Bracero program basically is a program in which growers brought people to the United States on a temporary basis in order to exploit their labor and then sent them home afterwards. In other words, people had no right to stay. And despite that, hundreds of thousands of braceros stayed anyway. And in fact, the community of Mexican American people in the United States has a lot of its roots in people who stayed during that period. But the the family preference system was a system that was set up in order to say we want a way in which people can come, and this has to do with that previous question, in which people can come to the United States and be part of communities here based on the relationships with people here. That system doesn't work very well anymore. In fact, if you, for certain visa category, for certain family members, you can sit in Manila or Mexico City for 20 plus years waiting for that visa to come. In fact, you know, the system has become really crazy because if you are an unmarried brother or sister and you're sitting in Manila, if you get married, you lose your status all of a sudden, and you lose even the 22-year wait. So people are forced into not having families in their countries of origin in order to keep qualifying for the ability to come here. So we need to make the system work again. It's not because it's a system that is based on our families, it's based on us. Not on employment. That being said, though, there are still also a lot of people who do not have family members in the United States, but who want to come and who need to come here in order to work. And the only system we have for that that deals with that is one in which employers kind of recruit people and then put them into this semi-indentured servitude type relationship, in which people don't have the right to stay here. So we need to change that and make it possible for people to come here to work if people want to work and then leave. In other words, why not give people green cards or permanent residence visas if people want to come here to work, and people can decide for themselves, you know, whether they want to stay here or whether they want to go back home at the end of the year or whether they want to stay here a couple of years. It's like, in other words, it gives people freedom of movement. And could this exist on an international level? That's a good question. And I think that in many ways, U.S. immigration policy has sometimes been the pattern for immigration policies that were implemented, for instance, in Europe or between Japan and Korea. And when we have good policies, other people tend to look at them and say, well, would that work for us? And when we have bad policies, the same thing happens. So I think that the best way of making sure that it happens in other places is for us to change our policies and our laws and make sure that it happens here. And then we'll see whether the people want to do.
Radio stations that broadcast in Spanish have notified people of protests and marches. Is there a Trump administration plan to shut these radio stations down? How do we protect these stations?
That's the question is, have Spanish language radio stations played an important role in organizing people for protests? And does the Trump administration want to shut them down? So first, yes, they played a very important role in 2006 in mobilizing people and still play that role. You know, I've been sort of waiting. I listen to Spanish language radio all the time. The Grande Yes Yes and Marco Gutierrez, who's here in San Francisco, a wonderful broadcaster. So if you don't listen to Marco, you should. And so, yes, they perform a very valuable service. And I'm kind of waiting to hear what the announcement for, you know, the kind of demonstrations we had in 2006. And I very much hope that that's coming. And those radio stations and those broadcasters are going to play a very important role. Does Trump want to shut them down? I think what Trump wants is he wants media that he can control. And so it's the content that he's after. So is he going to try and strip socially progressive content out of Spanish language radio? Of course, the same way as he's going to do it in English language radio as well, too. The mechanism for doing it, who knows? But remember that a lot of Spanish language media, Telemundo and so forth, belong to large corporations. And they're not necessarily on the corporate level all that progressive. The people who work for them are. So whether he can use that as a way of forcing them to clamp down in the same way, you know, we saw, you know, look what happened to the New York Times and the the Washington Post, when the people who worked there wanted to endorse Harris, and Jeff Bezos said, "Not in your life," you know. So you could see that. I could see that happening in Spanish language radio too, for sure.
Immigration Immigration policy in Canada has been a disaster and led to Justin Trudeau's resignation as Prime Minister. Some people there say that too many immigrants came and refused to assimilate to the culture, such as rules and language. What cultural expectations are warranted for people who immigrate?
So this is a dual question. Part of it is about Canada. Was Justin Trudeau's defeat owing to the crisis of immigration, which the questioner interprets as being that immigrants didn't adopt the culture of Canada and therefore created a political crisis as a result of that? Well, it's a complicated question. First of all, Canada has guest worker programs, which are bigger than the United States. Most of the produce that people eat in Canada is harvested by people who are coming to Canada under what's called the Special Agricultural Workers Program, which is basically the same as our H-2A program. And Canada's had this for years, and that program is just as exploitive as the one that we have here. It suppresses strikes and protests and so forth. And so, the people in Canada who are protesting Justin Trudeau are still eating the vegetables and the fruits that are harvested by the people who are brought there on that temporary basis. So these are people who are not refusing to assimilate. These are people who are deliberately being brought to Canada in a way that prevents them from being part of the communities that they are where they are working. That being said, there also are a lot of people living in Canada who are coming from other countries. All you have to do is go to Vancouver and see how big Chinatown is in Vancouver. It's enormous, and the population of Vancouver of people who are coming from China and South Asia, India, is very, very big. And so people are doing the same thing that we see here, the same thing as you see in the Mission or in Chinatown here. People are trying to figure out what it means to be, on the one hand, Chinese and speaking Chinese, and on the other hand, being here in the United States and being what we call an American, right? And so I think that in many cases, this is very uncomfortable for people who have lived many generations in either of these countries. And people look at that and they say, it's not the culture of the 1950s. This is not Ozzie and Harriet anymore. And I think, thank God, being a child of the Cold War, I was not very fond of that culture to begin with. But in any case, it's like saying that Canada and the US are multicultural countries. And obviously, you can run political campaigns, as Donald Trump just did, on the basis of saying, well, this is a terrible situation and we have to go back. Let's make America great again. Let's make Canada great again. What does that really mean? Let's make it like it looked, like the official vision of it was in 1955, which was white, middle class, no protests, no disruption. Let's just let corporate America do what it wants to do. Well, that's a big controversy in Canada, and Justin Trudeau just fell victim to it, just as Kamala Harris fell victim to it in the last election here. This is a big fight. This is a big struggle going on in both of our countries, for sure.
David, I'm sorry. I'm going to follow up on what you just mentioned about going back to 1955 and the nostalgia people have for that time. What was the percent of the workforce that participated in labor unions in 1955?
Trick question. What was the percentage of people who participated in unions in 1955? A lot higher than it is now. I think it was probably in 1955, I would guess that it was about 30% of the workforce, especially high in the private sector. In those years, the public sector didn't have as many unions as we have now, but the private sector was very well organized, much better organized. That was not a product of the Cold War. That was not a product of the official ideology and the official kind of self-image that the United States had of itself in 1955. It was a product of the CIO. It was a product of the 1930s. It was a product of what happened to working people as a result of the Depression and then the war. In other words, people fought to organize those unions in the face of sometimes incredible odds. And by the time you got to the end of World War II, that organizing had reached a peak. Remember, 1946, the big industrial unions in this country all went out on strike at the same time, relatively speaking, in order to make up for the loss in people's income that they had suffered during the war, when corporations made out like bandits and workers had their wages frozen. So that was a big deal. And at the same time, you had a big debate going on in the labor movement in this country about whether or not we were going to go to war with the Soviet Union or not, whether the Soviet Union was going to continue to be our ally as it had been in World War II, or whether we were going to enter a new period in the world in which the world would be divided between communist and anti-communist. And in the 1940s, unfortunately, what happened was that our labor movement purged itself. We had this incredible fight, and the left was driven out of a big part of our labor movement. Thank God, not the ILWU across the street here, but the ILWU was the exception. And so the labor peace, that peace of 1955, was an effort to contain what had happened before. It was an effort to contain that organizing effort. And as a result, you see the percentage of organized workers in this country falling and falling and falling and falling and falling to what it is right now, where I think we represent about 10 or 11% of the workforce in total. And in the private sector, more like about 6 or 7%.
Is there a centralized information source of immigrant rights actions?
Great question. Is there a centralized source of immigrant rights actions? No, there's not. There are organizations that are busy organizing people and putting out the word on what they are doing, and some of them also putting out the word on what other people are doing as well. So I think the best thing is to kind of name some of them. The one that I follow the most is called the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity. And this is Reverend Deborah Lee, who we've seen in the picture. In fact, we see right there. And they organize a lot of demonstrations themselves, and they also publicize what other organizations do. But there are other websites and other organizations out there. You know, there are ones in Washington, D.C., the National NILC, National Immigrant Legal Coalition. So I think the best thing to do is to use your search engine and Google for organizations that are involved in deportation defense.
So we could Bing for different organizations that are helping with that.
Although that's Microsoft, you know.
Could you comment on rapid response groups to intervene in ICE raids by being witnesses and shining a light on these actions?
Can I comment on rapid response networks to respond to immigration raids in which people go and observe? I think that is a very, very important idea and a very, very good one. There are rapid response networks that are organizing. Bay News Rising, for instance, that's another one where you can find news about demonstrations that are being organized. But not Bay News Rising, SF Rising, and there's another one in the East Bay, both have rapid response hotlines. And I think that the idea, which we ought to give credit to the Black Panthers for doing this as well, too. And that is that when there's actions by enforcement agents, police, and so forth, we have the right to observe. We have the right to go with our phones, with our law books and whatever, and observe. And the more we do that, the more we restrain them from carrying out these deportation raids. So this is a very, very important kind of activity to get involved in. And I would say get on one of those rapid response telephone trees or whatever notification it is that people are using. And if you are willing to do that, I think you have to have a little bit of courage to do it, but go out and do it for sure. It's very important.
Can you comment on the role of faith communities in the immigrant rights movement?
Can I comment on the role of faith communities in the immigrant rights movement? I think that the two parts of the immigrant rights movement that have been the most progressive in pushing forward have been the faith community and labor unions. Well, and no, third, the immigrant organizations within immigrant communities themselves. And remember, people have things like hometown associations in immigrant communities, which sometimes can be kind of apolitical, but sometimes become very political, like the ones for people from Oaxaca these days. But I think that the faith community has had a special voice. First of all, it is a moral voice. It is one that sort of doesn't base its calls on practicality, let's put it that way, that calls for equality, calls for basic rights, that talks about what our fundamental, I hate to say this, use this phrase because it's so overused, but what our human values are. In other words, what is the world that we want to live in? What does it look like? What is the Unitarian slogan or the thing that's on the t-shirts from about from a heart of love? Come on, help me. Oh, I used to see it all the time at the, I'm sorry? Thank you. Thank you. Stand on the side of love. That is a very, very eloquent call. It's like saying, let's love each other as human beings. And to do that in front of a detention center, I think is a very fundamental moral act. And so I think that the faith community has played a very, very, very important role. It's kind of a centering role. Unions are very powerful, and I'm a labor person and have been all my life, but unions also sometimes tend to look on what they decide to do and what they decide to say in terms of practicality. What's practical? What can we actually do that's going to move us forward tomorrow? And I think that the thing that the faith community brings is this idea of what is moral? What is the world that we want to live in? What do we have to advocate for? Even if we can't get it today, what do we have to fight for in order to really create a just world? What does a just world look like? So, yeah, I think faith communities, and I want to pay special attention or tribute to what has happened here in this church, because the Unitarian Church here in San Francisco has had such a long, long history of doing this. I was an anti-apartheid activist back in the 80s, and we had our meetings here. And the church itself, Reverend Carpenter, out on the picket lines, in the press conferences, that's a continuity. That kind of continuity, I think, is really important too. And I think the faith community has that.
Do you know how the asylum seeking process could be affected?
How is the asylum seeking process going to be affected? I assume you mean by affected by the Trump administration coming in.
We assume.
I think that they are going to try and end it. They don't believe in asylum. They think that asylum is just a trick that's being used by people who want to come to the United States for whatever nefarious purpose. So I think a lot of that is going to get fought out in courts. Unfortunately, the courts are different now from what they were in 2016. So I think that the asylum process, which is barely working in this country right now, is essentially probably going to stop by the end of the Trump administration. What that means also is that people who are applying for asylum are going to increasingly be waiting in detention camps in Mexico on the Mexican side of the border, waiting for something that never comes. That might be an unnecessarily negative way to look at it. If there are lawyers in the audience here who have a more hopeful view of it, perhaps you could say so. But I think that asylum in this country, this country's recognition of asylum was barely surviving under Biden. And I think that the government is going to try and stop it. And any effort to try to keep that from happening is going to be conducted by the courageous immigration lawyers that we have in this country, who are going to be in court all the time trying to challenge every move that's being made in that direction.
Can the Trump administration take away green cards?
Can the Trump administration take away green cards? Not without violating the law. The law we have still exists on the books, and people who have green cards, in other words, who have legal residence, still have that under present law. And legal residence can be, you can lose your legal residence for instance, being convicted of certain crimes. but you can't lose it just by being because the government wants to lift it. That being said, however, let's remember, for instance, the 1950s, when the government wanted to deport people who were labor organizers and communists in the 1950s in the McCarthyite scare, they did. They withdrew people's legal resident status and then deported them. And so it has happened in our history before. But I don't think that that's where the administration is going to go right away. I think where they're going to go right away is they're going to go after people who are undocumented first because they're such an attractive target. And I think that they're going to try and convince their base, their political base, that this is something that they can do and it is, worthwhile doing, and then move from there. But there are certainly people like Stephen Miller in the administration who do want to end immigration, period, the end, and who do see immigrants as being kind of like I think really what Stephen Miller thinks is that they're all going to vote for Democrats. And so this is a political move. I think Stephen Miller is a very amoral person and doesn't really care about the morality of immigration. He's looking at the political calculus here and seeing that immigration is a threat to the continued dominance of the right wing of the Republican Party. And that's a reason for going after illegal immigrants. But I don't think that that would happen right away.
If California's governor and the assembly write better legislation to protect immigrants, does federal law override it?
Does federal law override legislation passed in California protecting immigrants? This is really a lawyer's question rather than a question for me, I think, except that I know that there are cases in which the federal government, including the Supreme Court, does not want to overrule decisions by our state Supreme Court on state issues. So long as our state laws are held to be constitutional under our state constitution, I think that there is some safety from the federal Supreme Court and the federal government. But I think we have to look at case by case. We lost the law that would have made private immigration prisons illegal in California. We lost that one in the courts. We have another law, the law that protects people at work from unconstitutional workplace raids by ICE. And I think that one is likely to become, the federal government is likely to try and overturn that. But I think the federal government is also willing and able to use economic pressure, which is sometimes more effective than a long legal challenge. And that would include, for instance, in California, in San Francisco, for instance, we have had for a long time, San Francisco as a sanctuary city means that our police department will not hold people in city jail on a detainer from ICE. In other words, if you get arrested by the cops in San Francisco, and then ICE says, hold on to that person, even though it becomes clear to the police that you're not guilty of anything and you should be let go. And ICE says, well, we think that person, first of all, ICE can come into the jail and look at the immigration status of anybody who's in city jail here, and then say to the San Francisco police, we want you to detain this person, even if they're not guilty of the crime, because we think that they're undocumented. They can't do that in San Francisco and have not been able to do that for a while. The federal government, and this is what 287G is all about. The federal government, and Trump has already said that he is going to penalize cities that continue to do this by denying them federal funding. So that's a serious threat because San Francisco city government gets a lot of federal money for all kinds of stuff. And to say that all that's going to be cut off, whether Trump can legally do that or not, I think we're going to be fighting about that. So that, I think, is going to be much more the fight than the legal effort to try and overturn specific laws. I think what they're after is implementation. What they're after is to create an enforcement regime in which the federal government controls in which city police, state police, law enforcement authorities on a local level have no authority any longer and have to do whatever it is that the federal government is ordering them to do in terms of immigration enforcement.
We have to wrap up. There's a host of additional questions, David Bacon, that our audience may want to ask you offline. At this point, we're going to bring Jeff Peckrell back to talk about coming forums.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for this extremely timely and important message. Immigration will be in the news daily and weekly, and we're unfortunately likely to see our fellow community members being arrested and deported. So, as he said, people of faith need to be organized and take action against that, right? Just to wrap up with a couple of announcements. So next Sunday, we have Norm Solomon, the National Director of rootsaction.net. And he's also an author. Next Sunday, we have Norm Solomon, who is the National Director of rootsaction.org, coming to speak, and he'll be talking about militarism and U.S. foreign policy. And then also want to mention to you, we heard that this church was a leader in the anti-apartheid movement way back in the 80s. We're calling on this church to also be a leader in the anti-apartheid movement for Palestinian solidarity. So this Human Rights Working Group, which sponsors the forum, has authored a resolution for the church that will be voted on February 2nd, which expresses solidarity with Palestinians and decries settler colonialism and things like that. So we're asking you all to please vote for it. And next Sunday after church, there'll be a meeting in this room where we've arranged for several speakers to talk on this topic, a rabbi, a Christian minister, and a Palestinian. And it'll be a time for people to get more information about this topic and ask questions. Please come to that next Sunday after church. And then we don't currently have any forums scheduled for February, but we're working on getting something scheduled. We'll be back in after next Sunday. We'll be back for sure in March when we have Michael Cooper, author of a book called Crossroads of Empire. And then on 3/16, we have the Poor People's Campaign coming to speak here. So thank you everyone for coming and hope to see you next Sunday.